Looking at Federalist 77, Part 4. This is paragraph 8 we'll start off with. I could not with propriety conclude my observations on the subject of appointments without taking notice of a scheme for which there have appeared some, though but few advocates, I mean that of uniting the House of Representatives in the power of making them. I shall, however, do little more than mention it, as I cannot imagine that it is likely to gain the countenance of any considerable part of the community. A body so fluctuating and at the same time so numerous can never be deemed proper for the exercise of that power. Its unfitness will appear manifest to all when it is recollected that in half a century it may consist of 300 or 400 persons. All the advantages of the stability, both of the executive and of the Senate, would be defeated by this union, and infinite delays and embarrassments would be occasioned. The example of most of the states in their local constitutions encourages us to reprobate the idea. He says, those of you who are criticizing this provision and are saying that the House of Representatives should be also involved, when he uses the word union in this paragraph, he's talking about union of both the House of Representatives and the Senate. In other words, give the confirmation of these appointments to both the House and the Senate. And he says, we've already said this before, the House is already too numerous, and even that first Congress, there was only 65 of them. And he says that in a few decades, it's going to be 300 to 400 people. And that usually means, remember, he uses the word fluctuations here. And in the other Federalist Papers, he uses multitudinous. These are bad words for him. He says there's too many people, passions run high. And fluctuation, he hates that. He says it's up and down, up and down. In other words, it's not stable. You don't know what to count on, what law to expect to show up, who to be elected. They're in and out all the times. So he just uses that word as a nasty thing that can happen. If you remember earlier part of these readings of these Federalist Papers, I said Madison made two memoranda that are extremely important, ancient and modern. One of them is on ancient and modern confederacies, and the other one is vices of the political system of the U.S. It was here that he reviewed what had happened in the states, in the 13 states, and he said fluctuation, lack of stability, all these things that were happening. People were electing people to the members of their state legislature just to do what they wanted, rather than do what's wise and in the long-term interest of the country. So he doesn't like the House to be involved. I forgot to mention at the beginning of this Federalist that I've always mentioned these scholars' names. Actually, this gentleman, Jack Rakoff, was one of the scholars of the founding, and especially focuses on Madison, James Madison, quite a bit. He writes an article in this collection of articles here that appear in this book, Saving the Revolution. I've mentioned this book to you before, and it's really well worth your time reading it. He writes an article in this book on when these Federalist Papers for the first time were actually referred to by the other members of the government or by members of the government. And he says that the first time any of these Federalist Papers were brought up in the discussions in the House of Representatives or in the Senate was Federalist number 77. And he says that one of the South Carolina representatives brought this Federalist up. So when you get a chance, if you get a chance, definitely read this book as well as the other ones that I've mentioned to you. So this Federalist 77 gets the honor of being, according to Jack Rakoff, the first Federalist ever mentioned on the House floor after the Constitution was ratified. So let me return and start reading the rest of this Federalist Papers for you. And the next paragraph says, the only remaining powers of the executive are comprehended in giving information to Congress of the state of the Union. Well, this says it all. The President every year makes the State of the Union these days. In recommending to their consideration such measures as he shall judge expedient, in convening them or either branch upon extraordinary occasions, in adjourning them when they cannot themselves agree upon the time of adjournment, in receiving ambassadors and other public ministers, in faithfully executing the laws, and in commissioning all the officers of the United States. And the next paragraph, except some cavils about the power of convening either house of the legislature and that of receiving ambassadors, no objection has been made to this class of authorities, nor could they possibly admit of any. It required indeed an insatiable avidity for censure to invent exceptions to the parts which have been accepted to. In regard to the power of convening either house of the legislature, I shall barely remark that in respect to the Senate at least, we can readily discover a good reason for it. So he says they're even complaining that President can convene either house of the legislature in times of emergency. And he says there are times that you need a treaty to go through to be accepted, or emergencies come up. So why are you criticizing us for this? I shall barely remark that in respect to the Senate at least, we can readily discover a good reason for it. As this body has a concurrent power with the executive in the article of treaties, it might often be necessary to call it together with a view to this object, when it would be unnecessary and improper to convene the House of Representatives. As to the reception of ambassadors, what I have said in a former paper will furnish a sufficient answer. It says we've talked about part of this in another Federalist paper. And the last paragraph, we have now completed a survey of the structure and powers of the executive department. This was the 11th paper covering the provisions of authorities and responsibilities given to the president, to the executive branch. He continues, which I have endeavored to show combines, as far as Republican principles will admit, all the requisites to energy. The remaining inquiry is, does it also combine the requisites to safety in a Republican sense, a due dependence on the people, and a due responsibility. Remember, he keeps on saying that we want a Republican form of government, a due dependence on the people, elections take place at known intervals, and then people give their representatives the responsibility of doing their best during their term in office. The answer to this question has been anticipated in the investigation of its other characteristics and is satisfactorily deducible from these circumstances, from the election of the president once in 4 years by persons immediately chosen by the people for that purpose, and from his being at all times liable to impeachment, trial, dismission from office, incapacity to serve in any other, and to forfeiture of life and estate by subsequent prosecution in the common course of law. It says, if a president doesn't do his job, it can be impeached, thrown out of office, and then if he's done something really wrong, he can actually be tried, and then even his life, his property, everything that he has can be taken away from him if we find that he's done something wrong, that what he has gained is from his office. So he says, these are some of the, yes, we've given you an energetic executive branch, but at the same time, people can decide through their representatives, through their senators, whether this person sacrificed the honor of office just for money or for fame. So it says we've given you that tool too. But these precautions, great as they are not the only ones which the plan of the convention has provided in favor of the public security. In the only instances in which the abuse of the executive authority was materially to be feared, the Chief Magistrate of the United States would be, by that plan, be subjected to the control of a branch of the legislative body. What more could be desired by an enlightened and reasonable people? So he says, you people have sent great delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and they've come up with a great system that would be great for your safety, prosperity, happiness, and liberty. So this ends the Federalist Papers that covered the office, the executive branch. In 78, he returns to the judicial branch, the judiciary.